Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Robert Litvak, the Center's Senior Vice President. Today is Day at Wilson, where we welcome all of you to showcase our extraordinary in-house talent. My colleagues who are program directors and program associates with extraordinary depth and breadth of knowledge. And today you'll be treated to two panels. First, Borders as a National Security Crisis, and then that'll be followed by kind of a roundup of hotspots, Venezuela, North Korea, and the Middle East. The first panel is Borders as a National Security Crisis, and it will be moderated by Tony Wayne, who has been affiliated for, how many years has it been now, Tony?
It was three.
He's co-chair of our Mexico Institute. He's been a public policy fellow. Came to us after a distinguished career at the State Department. His bio, as well as that of the speakers, have been distributed. I will turn the floor over to Tony, who will tee up this afternoon's topic and introduce our panelists, my esteemed colleagues. So over to you, Tony.
All right. Thank you very much, Rob. Well, it's great that you're all here this afternoon, and in case nobody knows, borders have been sort of an important topic in the United States debate recently. So it's a good opportunity to explore some of these issues on both borders. Most of the focus has been on the southern border, but we get to talk about the northern border with Laura Dawson, who knows everything there is to know practically about Canada.
And when I don't know, I make up.
And that's right. And she's very, very good at that, only surpassed by Duncan Wood on the other side, who is very good at
inventing facts about Mexico.
Inventing facts about Mexico and North America and sounding very persuasive in doing it. And we're also really happy to have Rachel Schmidtke with us, who has joined a bit more recently, but is following the migration issues, which are, as you know, are very complex, involving Central America, Mexico, and the United States. So I think we're going to have a really good discussion. Let me just note that to begin with, as you're thinking about borders, that borders are a place of security and a place of opportunity and prosperity. And they both reside with each other. At the same time, all sorts of good things are happening at borders, bad things can happen at borders. And addressing both of them requires more than just thinking about the borders. You have to think about a layered concept to both the prosperity aspect of borders and the security aspect of borders. You want to start your homeland security at the border of your neighboring country, or better yet, at the points of departure of visitors coming into that neighboring country, and then as they travel through that neighboring country to get to your border. And then after they might get across your border, or things might get across the border, you want to have layers behind that to look for any bad things that might have snuck across. And so it's not surprisingly, we'll say, it's rather simplistic just to think of the border, or just to think of a wall, or just to think of any one aspect of it. A real solution to managing borders well involves a whole range of tools and processes and collaborations in your own country and with your neighboring countries and with your neighbors. And so we're going to talk a bit about that. Just for example, to think about our southern border, where we've had a lot of talk about emergencies. There's a piece out there where I argued there really are 3 emergencies that touch our southern border, but none of them are really going to be solved by the wall. The wall might be part of a solution, but we have an emergency of illegal drugs coming into the United States, a lot across that southern border, but some across the northern border also. We have massive profits from drug sales in the United States and arms purchased with that flowing southward, and some of it probably going other ways also across our borders to get back to those people that initiated the drug flows. And we have the migrants headed north, but also some that come through Canada. and the reasons that are pushing them out of their home countries, and the hardships that they face along the way to try to get to a place that they think is going to offer solutions to them, the United States. And then we have our own problems and our own systems of being more effective in handling each of these issues. So we're going to talk a little bit about all of those today. It's great to have you with us, and I'm going to ask Laura to start off, and everybody will give a few minutes of initial comments, and then we'll come back and have some discussion among ourselves, and then we'll invite all of you to participate. Thank you. Laura, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Tony. Now, I can hear your eyes rolling in your head. You're going, national security crisis, Canada, what happened? You run out of ice. Tim Hortons run out of coffee. There's no national security crisis with Canada. When we talk security crisis, we want to talk Iraq. We want to talk North Korea. We want to talk, real risk, not those mamby-pambies from north of the border. So I have renamed my part of the presentation as the importance of border cooperation to prevent national security crisis. How's that? Is that better? Mm-hmm. So how many of you, show of hands, have flown to the United States through Canada? Flown from Canada, yay! So most of you, if not all of you, have gone through a pre-clearance facility in Canada, where you've literally crossed the border into the United States while standing at Pearson Airport in Toronto or Vancouver Airport, and you're on American soil, and that seems really cool. And that is essentially, that pre-clearance facility is actually a metaphor for the bigger relationship. When we started having pre-clearance at airports decades ago, in fact, it wasn't because the U.S. government wanted to make it easier for Canadian travelers, although it certainly is, and thank you. It was because the U.S. government saw the advantage of keeping the bad guys outside of the homeland, keeping the bad guys off of U.S. soil and having them pre-cleared by and vetted and screened by friendly allies north of the border and now elsewhere. So think of Canada, that 4,500, 5,000-mile border, as a giant pre-clearance vetting facility for the security of the United States homeland. When you think of it in that context, Canada seems a lot more important, doesn't it? We have been cooperating intensively and closely on not just border management, but as Tony says, way beyond the border, on law enforcement, on immigration, on narcotics issues. When 9/11 hit, we had a real risk of those borders closing, of putting up some very extensive barriers and walls and preventing commerce, preventing tourism, preventing movement of people back and forth. But some really smart guys, like John Manley, who's sitting back there, who was a Canadian minister at the time, and Governor Tom Ridge, who was the first head of Department of Homeland Security, said, no, we've got to figure out a way to make this a secure and prosperous border. And they came up with a framework for border security that facilitated tourism, travel, trade, etc. And it was a really remarkable document that continues to serve us very well. But it required a leap of faith and cooperation from both of our governments, and that we resist the urge to roll up the drawbridges and put up the walls. And so it was quite a leap of faith at that time. So we worked together on pre-screening of refugees and migrants. There is no refugee or migrant who comes to Canada who has not been fully checked and vetted through a U.S. list. Our law enforcement cooperation is extensive and ongoing every single day. Military cooperation is seamless, works very, very well together. The thing that most people are aware of is NORAD, the radar air defense system, but it is extensive in many, many other ways. As you know, of course, Canada is the largest export market for the United States. Canada buys more products from the United States than China, Japan, and many parts of the European Union combined. Canada is also the second largest source of tourists for the United States after Mexico. And from a country with 34 million people, that's quite an extensive tourism investment. So we are embedded and integrated and cooperating and making sure that that northern buffer works very, very well to protect the U.S. homeland. Canada and Mexico are also very lucky to have the United States as a great neighbor. We have a great neighborhood. But over the past year and a half, 2 years, that neighborhood has been under threat. Where the relationship is becoming fractured. Tony mentions refugees. Did you know that 40,000 refugees have come from the United States into Canada over the last 2 years? Now, some of them are refugees who are just trying their luck and thinking maybe they'll have a better time with Canada than the United States. But some of them are coming from uncertain circumstances with temporary protected status, those programs for Hondurans and El Salvadorans being under threat. Fully 30% of those American refugees to Canada are American citizens. They are the children of people with uncertain status in the United States. So at Roxham Road near Montreal, the RCMP is collecting these migrants, arresting them. They have to be arrested, so they'll get a hearing later. And now half of the homeless shelter spaces in Toronto are taken up with these refugees, and Olympic Stadium in Montreal is a refugee camp. Did you ever imagine that we would be in this situation where American refugees from the United States are flooding into Canada? It is a period of disequilibrium that is unsustainable for the long term. And then you have the state of the relationship in that Canadians still love Americans, absolutely. But being called cheaters, being called national security threats, the country that cooperated with the United States in the rebuilding after 9/11, supplying the steel for the Twin Towers. Anytime there's a crisis, Mexicans and Americans are there with power trucks and whatever it takes to help the neighbors. To be told you're a national security threat has a visceral level effect. And so in Canada, there's very little appetite among the populace for renewed big cooperation projects with the United States. It's just bad politics. No conservative, no liberal is going to agree to a new project. And so they're going to continue with some of the under-the-radar incremental projects, and some of them are very good. We just finished passing our entry-exit information sharing program. So now we know not only who's coming into our country, but who's leaving our country. So that's an important development. But we really, in this uncertain time with so many new threats, we really need to renew our cooperation and renew our commitment to each other. And I don't see that the political circumstances are going to allow us to do that. In the meantime, Wilson Center, a lighting a candle rather than curse the darkness. We're involved in what we're calling the North American 2.0 project. And this is a book and meeting project that we're doing with a number of other organizations throughout North America, in which we're identifying 14 or 15 areas where the three countries can really and truly work together to create the vision for North America that we would like to see in a decade, 2 decades. We're doing everything from energy, workforce development, movement of people, cybersecurity, security, running the whole gamut to try to bring some new ideas and new thinking to some very, very important issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. If I might maybe ask Duncan, who is our North American resident up here, having spent several years in all 3 countries of North America and developed a very deep understanding of Mexico, to talk a little bit about the situation with Mexico and the history of that, and then we'll ask Rachel to talk a bit about the migrants.
Sure. Thank you, Tony. And thank you, Laura, for setting things up perfectly there. What I'd like to talk about is a little bit of the historical rapprochement that we've seen over the past 15 years between Mexico and the United States on security issues. When voices here in the United States declare that Canada is a national security threat or that there is a national emergency on the border, what they neglect to tell you is the incredibly high level of cooperation that we've seen in recent years between Mexico and the United States on a wide number of issues concerning migration and security. And I don't want to step onto Rachel's turf at all by talking about migration. But what I do want to talk about is just a little bit about how over the past, well, really over the past 19 years, Mexico and the United States have come closer and closer together and have built levels of trust that were hitherto unimaginable. If we think about, what happened in 2007, when Mexico and the United States came together and signed something called the Merida Initiative, a broad-based security cooperation agreement that was focused on combating organized crime, drug flows, and violence in Mexico. And the way in which that agreement has developed in recent years, so that we now see that it's not just because there has been almost $2 billion transferred from the United States to Mexico to help Mexican authorities in their fight against organized crime. It's much more that we've brought together agencies on both sides of the border that now have begun to overcome the old suspicions that always existed there. Until relatively recently in Mexico, the United States was portrayed as the enemy. The United States was the country that had invaded, that had stolen half of Mexican territory, that was really not seen to be a country that was to be trusted at all. But over the past 20 years, we've seen growing levels of trust. And a large part of that has been because there has been much more intense cooperation and interaction between security agencies north of the border and south of the border. And so what we've seen is, and some people have made the comparison between the Merida Initiative, which brings together Mexican and U.S. security forces, with NORAD. That's what it did to the U.S.-Canada relationship. By putting U.S. and Canadian forces alongside each other to protect the North American airspace, all of a sudden you began to see much higher levels of understanding and trust. It was essentially a socialization process. And that's really what we've seen since the signing of the Merida Initiative back in 2007. U.S. agencies, military, public security, homeland security, have come together with their Mexican counterparts and have begun to understand each other in ways which they didn't before. And that's very, very important. It's very, very important because it allows for things that would not have been possible before. Of course, the other great driver of all of this was 9/11, and the fact that, after Canada took the lead on proposing smart borders between the United States and Mexico, we began to see that, as Tony correctly identified at the beginning of this panel, that where there is risk, there's also opportunity. And what we saw out of the Smart Borders Initiative, which was replicated in the U.S.-Mexico relationship, was that we began to see that there wasn't necessarily a trade-off between efficiency at the border and security at the border. In fact, if you heightened security, you could also heighten efficiency. And perhaps the best example of that is trusted traveler and trusted shipper programs. The kind of pre-clearance that Tony has talked about, where we see that, I want just a show of hands. How many people are a member of Global Entry in this room? There you go. It's a good international audience. Is anybody a member of Nexus or Sentry? Good. Look at that. That's wonderful. Well done, you Canadians and Mexicans. I would love to join, but they keep me out because I'm not a citizen of any one of the countries. One day, perhaps. Now, those trusted traveler programs, of course, what do we do when we join them? We basically submit a whole bunch of data about ourselves. They do a background check on us, and they don't eliminate the threat, but they recognize that we are an acceptable threat as we cross the border. That is something which came out of a huge threat that came into the United States, and Mexico and Canada, like very good friends, but also self-interested neighbors, recognized that they had to come up with proposals that would make the United States feel more comfortable with them. And so I think that what we've seen through the Smart Borders, trusted traveler programs, is that, again, there is a level of trust there that really wasn't there 20 years ago. Third point that I'd like to make is to echo something that Tony said at the beginning about Homeland Security, that we tend to think of it as at the border because that's when we come up against Homeland Security. I mean, unless you work at the at the Reagan building and you're constantly going past CBP, it's when you get to either a border or to an air or sea border that we come up against homeland security in person. But as Tony said, protecting the homeland, securing the homeland has to happen at distance. And let me just tell you that based upon the trust that has been developed between Mexico and the United States over the last 20 years or so, we've really begun to see that Mexico has become an important partner. In the same way that Canada has become a very, very important partner, Mexico has become an important partner. And just one example. When passenger planes coming into Mexico, when they land in Mexico, Mexico shares all of the passenger lists and the data they have on those passengers with U.S. authorities, so that the United States is fully aware of anybody flying into Mexico from any other part of the world so that they can begin to do their own checks. This is a very, very important element in securing the U.S. homeland. And Mexico does this more than any other country. They provide more data to the United States than any other country. So trust has been built, trust has been developed. And in 2014, Mexico began to develop something called Plan Frontera Sur, which was their southern border plan, not the U.S. southern border, but Mexico's southern border with Guatemala and Belize. And the Plan Frontera Sur was to begin to build up facilities at Mexico's southern border to control flows of people, but it was also designed to be part of the strategy against organized crime and also to make sure that there was a better capacity for gathering data at Mexico's southern border so that we knew exactly who and what was coming into Mexico. Now, it's incomplete, it's far from perfect, but it's a very, very big step in the right direction. Let me just show you, if we can lower the screen for a second. Thank you. I want to show you a couple of graphics which will highlight how successful these efforts have been. This is a chart that was put together by my colleagues at the Mexico Institute, and it shows you the 23 border counties along the U.S. side of the border. And as you will see, out of 23 border counties, 22 of them are safer than their similar counterparts in other parts of the United States. That shows that the border works. The violence that we've seen in Mexico, and let me just shift to this one, organized crime-style homicides taken from our friends at the Justice in Mexico project out in San Diego. You can see the darker colors are where most of the violence happens. And we see, thank you very much, and we can see that there are very real areas of risk up there in northern Mexico. This is 2017, and the situation in northern Mexico has got worse since then. If we move to a county by county or municipality by municipality approach, you can see some of the most dangerous municipalities in 2018 were actually towards the north of the country. But that violence hasn't crossed the border. That's an extraordinary thing. That tells us that the border works, and of course that U.S. institutions work, and organized crime that operates in Mexico is more afraid of operating north of the border. But I think it's a very, very important indicator for us that security cooperation between Mexico and the United States actually does a very, very good job. Now, having provided you with that optimistic outlook on things, let me just highlight one other thing. And this is one thing which is a real threat, and Tony has talked about this and he's written about this recently. We've published 2 papers through the Mexico Institute which looks at the fentanyl threat as it concerns Mexico. One paper which looks at Mexico's role in the fentanyl trade coming into the United States, and another paper which looks at the impact of fentanyl on Mexico itself. But this little chart, or map rather, it's a little bit unclear unfortunately, but basically we see how fentanyl and precursor chemicals come into Mexico and then they find their way north, predominantly up into California. And we see that this is a very, very real threat. And this is something where the United States needs Mexico's cooperation. And up until recently, Mexico has really not been taking on enough of the responsibility to address the fentanyl crisis in the United States, but it's an issue which is being discussed right now. The reason why I raise this is because in addition to all of the threats and opportunities that I identified earlier on, we're of course going through a very interesting change in Mexico. We have a new government which so far is cooperating quite nicely with the United States on a number of issues. And in fact, the Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, wants to avoid any kind of conflict with the United States because he's focused on his domestic agenda. But Right now, I think we're in a very interesting position, because what we need to keep this kind of cooperation going into the future to combat things like the fentanyl crisis, to make sure that cooperation on organized crime, public security, and of course in combating terrorism continues. We need to make sure that the relationship, which has been so delicately constructed over the past 20 years, isn't damaged irreparably. Over the past 2 years, we saw so many attacks on Mexico from the White House and from other sections of the U.S. public and public policy representatives that, in fact, the opinion in Mexico of the United States has taken a bit of a battering. It's begun to rebound a little bit recently. But certainly we don't want to jeopardize that very, very important relationship that we have with an incredibly important neighbor who is acting, as Laura suggested, as a bit of a filter for us. And yes, Mexico has very real problems in its own territory, but Mexico can play an incredibly important role in securing the U.S. homeland. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan. Maybe for Rachel's remarks, we can move off the fentanyl slide.
Thanks.
How's that?
No.
This one?
Go back to the safe. There we
There
go.
we go.
That's a nicer one.
Have an uplifting picture.
Okay, Rachel, please talk to us a little bit about what's going on in the migration area.
Okay. Yes, migration at the U.S. southern border. It's a very obscure topic. I'm sure no one has heard of it. Kidding. In all seriousness, it is a situation that is becoming increasingly complicated and in urgent need of address. In the last 6 months, there's been an upsurge in the number of migrants arriving to the U.S.-Mexico border, with unauthorized entries nearly double what they were a year ago. On average, 2,200 migrants arrive to the southwest border a day, and Secretary Nielsen is projecting that the U.S. is on track to apprehend approximately 900,000 people along the southern border this year, which is the highest that it's been in over a decade. And although the number of migrants that are arriving to the U.S.-Mexico border haven't reached the peak levels that they were back in 2000, for example, what has changed is the demographic of people that are coming. Family units have now surpassed any other category of migrants that are arriving at the southern border. DHS and Mexico's National Migration Institute are dealing with the challenges of looking after tens of thousands of Central American parents and children who have very different needs and require special protections and care that single adult men do not. And it's because of this demographic shift that the United States and Mexico are dealing with a dire humanitarian situation at the border, as sick children, exhausted families arrive in need of medical attention and other care. The U.S.'s immigration system is under quite a lot of strain, with over 800,000 cases pending in immigration courts, which is in part due to the mounting backlog of asylum claims at the southern border. Overcrowded border facilities, given that families cannot be quickly deported as single adult men in the past were, and border workers who are pulled away from duties at the border to provide increasingly more humanitarian care. So the situation is sounds bleak right now and is slightly dire. And adding further complexity to the situation, Mexico's role as a partner in migration management is changing under President López Obrador's administration. Mexico's always been a partner to the United States in terms of migration management, and they're doing quite a lot in terms of promoting more orderly migration, offering humanitarian visas, but they're moving away from enforcement strategies at their southern border, which are allowing more migrants to come through Mexico to the U.S. border. So the situation itself with Mexico and the U.S. is complex, and there are some tensions. And I think the implementation of the U.S. policy migrant protection protocols, which most of us know as Remain in Mexico, is an indicator of some of these tensions. The policy is fraught with some problems, starting with the lack of dialogue between the two countries and its implementation, and some confusion on the public messaging of this practice. The strategy also marks an unprecedented change in asylum policy and calls into question the legality of returning asylum seekers to a place where they feel unsafe, and is placing a burden on Mexican border communities to provide migrants shelter, food, and general care. But the beginning of a new administration in Mexico does provide fresh opportunity for dialogue and cooperation, but both countries must come together to find common ground to manage these flows. And to relieve some of the mounting pressure that's accumulating at the border. So hopefully today the meeting between Secretary Nielsen and Secretary Sanchez Cordero will hopefully move that needle forward towards...
Who is?
Oh, Secretary Sanchez Cordero is the Secretary of Governance in Mexico. And so she and Secretary Nielsen are meeting today to discuss human smuggling, some of the issues around the migrant protection protocols. And so hopefully this conversation moves that needle forward towards better coordination, which is needed because in the short term, I think these trends will continue. The push factors for Central Americans are significant and have been so for years. The homicide rate, which is declining, but is still high. Governance is weak, and there's a lack of confidence in institutions. Climate change and food security will only continue to threaten livelihoods. And frankly, the subordination of women in both public and private spheres will also continue to push women and children towards the United States. And it also is becoming easier for migrants to arrive at the U.S.-Mexico border. Caravans are becoming more common. It's safer to travel through Mexico in large numbers. Human smuggling is becoming a more sophisticated, efficient, and lucrative operation. I mean, maybe some people have read about the reports of these fast-track buses that are coming from Mexico to the United States. So it offers greater opportunities for migrants to travel undetected and faster, but it also increases their vulnerability to exploitation, kidnapping, assault, abuse, and it diminishes our capacity to ensure migrants enter through legal channels. So, sorry, that's again a very bleak picture right now, what I'm painting, but hopefully we can go into some solutions later. But to wrap it up, migrants themselves are not a threat to our nation's security, but the growing number of migrants arriving threatens to overwhelm the capacity of our institutions and systems that are not evolved to meet the demographic changes. So we've got to find a way to move beyond political rhetoric and some of the short-term strategies to look towards solutions that respect sovereignty and rule of law, of course, but don't eschew our international responsibility of providing safe haven to those who are fleeing legitimate harm. So I'll end on that.
Good. Thank you very much. Okay, let's explore a little bit of these challenges. We have flow of goods, flow of people, maybe related flows of money. So to start off, let's talk about a certain good, the fentanyl good. It affects all three countries. Fentanyl arrives largely from China, and it comes into all three countries directly through the mail system. A lot of it comes in the United States and through FedEx and UPS and all the other parcel delivery services. But a bunch comes through ports and then up through the borders. So what can we do better? What ideas do we have for taking this effort further from both country perspectives, but then also maybe across the continent, to think through this problem? Clearly, there's a whole demand side which needs to be addressed, which is that all the people are still buying this in the United States, and they spend $20 to $30 billion a year buying these kind of drugs in the U.S. So that's a lot of draw for people. So we have to address that side. But let's think about where we could take, what are some next steps we might be able to take. And I know there's some challenges in both of these relationships in that cooperation. So please,
sure,
Laura and
I'll jump
Duncan.
in very briefly because I'm not an expert in this area, but I mean, fentanyl is an incredibly difficult product because such small quantities can be so toxic. And it's very, very hard to detect through sniffers or any other technology that exists. So we really need to follow the intelligence trail. Canada and the U.S. Authorities do cooperate very well on this. Police services do cooperate very well. City police, RCMP, Department of Justice, etc. Canada is a little bit hinky to deal with sometimes because of privacy, release of information. Concerns. So if you are just sort of fishing on a hunch, the Canadian official probably can't open that file or share that file. And I've heard cases of the Canadian official in the federal police talking to U.S. FBI and saying, can you read what you see on that screen in front of you from the city police? Because I can't talk to the city police. So there's a few hinky things with respect to information sharing, but it's a very productive relationship relationship and certainly open to more cooperation. Also, there's a weird loophole in Canada where if you're a courier service, if you're UPX or FedEx, you are obligated within an inch of your life to look through and ensure that there are no drugs or contraband products in anything you're shipping. But the rule turns on its head with respect to Canada Post, and Canadian postal inspectors have a really, really hard time usurping the integrity of the mail. It's an old rule to look into that package to determine whether or not there might be some drugs there. So if you want to ship drugs on the dark web in Canada, make sure you send it by Canada Post, because that is the most effective way to do it. So says Maclean's magazine.
It's part of the IPU Basic Treaty that was signed at the beginning of the 1900s, and the United States has that problem also, which is why this administration has talked about pulling out of that treaty, actually. So it affects a lot of countries. But anyway, Duncan.
So, I mean, in addition to the kind of cooperation that Laura is talking about, I think that there are some concrete things that can be done, some of which are being done already in Mexico. And if I go back to the chart or the map of fentanyl, if we look at the ports of Manzanillo and Lázaro Cárdenas, which are on Mexico's Pacific coast, Mexico has a really tough time policing its own ports. And generally, these have not been considered to be a threat to the United States because they're in Mexican territory. But just as planes landing in Mexico may carry terrorists, and so it's good that we have a clear idea of who's on those planes, the goods that are coming in from Asia into Manzanillo and Lázaro Cárdenas, we should be working harder to vet those. And it's a challenge in all ports around the world, because you can't possibly check every item inside every container that's coming in this case from China or from Asia. But what we could do is we could improve the filters that we have there. And so in recent years, U.S. and Mexican authorities have begun to cooperate more closely in the port of Lázaro Cárdenas to try to strengthen Mexican capacities. My proposal is a very simple one. You already have pre-clearance facilities for freight coming into the United States. Why not put U.S. pre-clearance in Mexican ports, whereby you would have U.S. agents who would be checking containers that are coming into Mexico, specifically those containers that are going on to the United States? Because a lot of the containers that come in just get straight on one of the NAFTA highways and head up to Laredo, Nuevo Laredo, and cross over. What if you could do the pre-clearance right there, you seal the container, and it goes on its way? Everybody wins. Mexico has less of the drugs coming into its territory. The United States ensures that these containers are safe, and the shipper has a huge advantage because it's already been pre-cleared. So it doesn't have to go through clearance once it reaches the border. These are the kind of things, they're relatively simple, but it all depends upon whether or not you can maintain the trust levels that we've begun to build up in this bilateral relationship. And as Rachel indicated, we're in a period of flux right now. On migration, we don't know whether this kind of cooperation is going to continue. And we're hopeful that it will on security issues. But these things are very delicate. So hopefully, wise heads will continue to prevail.
So just to build on that, Duncan, so two of the things that you and I have both wrestled with is that for the United States, the drugs are a big high priority. For the Mexicans, the homicides are a big priority. And Duncan didn't show some of the other graphs we have that show that criminal homicides in Mexico have just skyrocketed. They've set new records. In 2017 was a new record. 2018 was a new record. January was the most violent January ever recorded since 1997. So that, understandably, that's the focus of the new government. So how do you get them, how do we find a common agenda? How do you think we bring people together between the United States and Mexico so that there's attention to what's our priority is, and as well as an attention to their understandable priority of bringing the violence down?
Without wishing to risk the wrath of the NRA, there's an issue that your country has. And it's guns. And you decide what you do with guns in your own country. That's up to you. But the fact is a lot of those guns go south. The United States needs to make much more of an effort in trying to stop those weapons crossing the border into Mexico. Mexico has been demanding this for many, many years. Stop sending weapons down to Mexico. And there are things that Mexico itself needs to do. Remember that Mexico's border patrol is really not much of anything. And for those of you who have crossed, for example, by foot between Mexico and the United States, or from the United States into Mexico, go across the border in Tijuana, you get to a turnstile, you go through a turnstile, and all of a sudden, bienvenido a Mexico. It's like, wait a second, did I just cross an international border? Because I'm not sure that anybody checked my passport or anybody checked what was in my bag. That needs to stop. Mexico needs to do more on that. But the United States, through a quid pro quo, could say, look, you want to reduce homicides in your country. We want to reduce the amount of drugs coming north. Let's talk about the things that we could do to really reduce the flow of weapons going south. And we've spoken, Tony and I have spoken to people in the U.S. government and in U.S. armed forces and security agencies who are willing to do that. But of course, it becomes a highly polemical issue, particularly when you get a foreigner saying to the United States, you know, you've got a problem with guns, as I just did, and maybe I should retract my comments. But for example, when former President Felipe Calderon...
You're not an American citizen. So
there you go, so it's fine. When former President Felipe Calderon came up to Washington back in, I think it was 2010, 2009, and he said, you know, the United States has to deal with guns. It didn't do any good to the relationship. So what you do need to do is you need to hold these conversations behind closed doors. And it needs to be part of that socialization process. It needs to be part of that building of trust.
Thank you very much. So, Rachel, now for a similarly difficult question for you. So, Lopez Obrador came to power, said we want to respect the human rights of migrants. They can come here and stay here, and we're going to take care of them. He's also said we don't want to interfere in the politics of other countries, but we now see these thousands and thousands of migrants being facilitated in their travel through the United States to come up and try and get on the U.S. border, go across the U.S. border. Isn't that interfering in the United States? How do we deal with the Mexican approach that allows all these people to come in, not to come in, that's fine, but then to move north and arrive at our border and try and get across there? What kind of approaches do you think and adjustments might help deal with this? Because it's clearly building up to create problems between Mexico and the United States.
Yes, absolutely. And I think Duncan touched on this of needing the importance of Mexico-U.S. cooperation on this topic. I think there's a couple things that can be done to sort of relieve a little bit of pressure off the border. One would be bolstering the Mexican Commission for Refugee Assistance in Mexico so that they can actually process claims more efficiently and quickly in Mexico, so that incentivizes more asylum seekers to stay in Mexico. That would be one thing. I think training the National Migration Institute of Mexico. I'm going to call it INAMI. That's easier for me to say. So the INAMI, to train them, there's been some reports of lower level corruption and just inefficiencies in the implementation of a lot of laws. So I think professionalizing and making them a little bit more efficient in the work that they do. Obviously, better data sharing between the two countries. I think another one would be working on screening migrants who come through Mexico's southern border who have a criminal history. And we can, I think, all agree that we don't want criminals coming through either country. So working to have more enforcement strategies for at least those with criminal histories. And I think finally, having some sort of maybe employment-based visa program in Mexico. There aren't that many legal options for Central American migrants to actually come and stay and work in Mexico and have access to job opportunities that are not infringing upon Mexican citizens' ability to also have competitive jobs. So I think being more targeted and thinking of legal channels for migrants to stay in Mexico would be some solutions to get pressure off of the border itself and work with Mexico.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Laura, you've thought a lot about processes at the border. And so processes can apply in both borders, even if in some ways processing has been gone forward faster on the northern border. So what do you see as next steps that could service both the prosperity goals and the knowing what's crossing and who's crossing, that might take place first or move ahead first on the north that we could then apply in the south? What are the kind of things that will come next in this relationship across North America, which is so important we haven't really talked about, but there's $1.3 trillion worth of trade going on. So there's $1 million a minute of trade between the U.S. and Mexico, and $1.25 million between Canada and the United States. And then on the south, 1 million travelers each day, and a little bit fewer than that, but many hundreds of thousands that cross in the north. So what do you see as the next steps that would be good?
Sure. I think we've got no shortage of lists. There's a lot of organizations and individuals who have committed themselves at the various modes of transportation: air, rail, land, etc. And again, Wilson Center, Canada Institute, Mexico Institute is going to be involved in some conversations on that in the coming weeks and months. So there's no shortage of lists of how we should approach, and there's some great technologies. Here I am waving the flag again, but if you've used an expedited kiosk machine at Customs at Atlanta Airport or any of the other more advanced American airports, that was developed in Vancouver by YVR. So there's no shortage of technologies. There's no shortage of lists. What we lack, though, is a strong governance framework that holds people's feet to the fire and says it's not enough just to develop the technologies. You have to actually implement them. So years ago, we developed a CTPAT PIP program, which is for trusted shipper programs for the U.S. and for Canada, and they were supposed to work on an integrated level, except that the Canadian, based on RFID chips, the little chips that are embedded in cards that transmit a certain amount of information, except that the Canadian ports, many of them don't have a chip reader. So the trucks are coming towards the border, they're 5 miles away or one mile away, ready to send that information to the port, and there's nobody there to read it. So instead of having advanced preparation when you get to the port, you still have that 90 seconds or 2 minutes, and you take millions of shipments and you multiply that by 90 seconds. That's a lot of missed opportunities. Similarly, we will tend to invest in technologies but not put enough people at the port to actually deal with it. And I was chuckling a little bit when Duncan suggested the pre-clearance container project, because there was a pilot project in Prince George. Somebody out there will correct me, but I'm going to say Prince George, to check containers coming from Asia, going to Canada, destined to the United States. And instead of speeding things up because they were pre-cleared at the Canadian border by U.S. officials, the U.S. officials there just had a more exhaustive list of things to check when it actually hit the U.S. border. It's like, hey guys, I think there's animal products. Let's make sure we get the Fish and Wildlife people there, or et cetera, et cetera. So rather than speeding things up, it actually slowed things down. But institutional support for these big projects that gives us the momentum and the resources to follow through on the many good ideas we have.
Thank you. Okay, please, questions from all of you. Commentary.
Nobody.
Right back there.
It's Richard Sanders, former DCM.
You can't ask about Canada, Richard. No, you can't.
No,
you can.
Richard Sanders is a former DCM at Embassy Ottawa, so he's going to correct me on everything that I just said incorrectly.
No, I actually have a question. But one area that's not really been touched on in the conversation is kind of the flip side of security and all this is infrastructure. And I know when I served in Canada, there were endless painful issues about whether bridges would be built in Detroit. I know on the Mexican border, they're financing NAD Bank and things like that. Is there anything people are thinking about to kind of to increase, to improve what seems to be kind of an infrastructure deficit at both borders?
Written into the new USMCA is a chapter that actually does mention facilitation at the borders that might help. I do not believe there's anything else underway to take us past the situation that you observed?
The only thing is a piece of legislation that's currently being put forward to Congress,
Right.
there is
that.
which looks at U.S.-Mexico cooperation and says that we need to do more to invest at the border. And part of the answer to that is to actually expand the mandate of the North American Development Bank. And a lot of people have said this over the years. You know, it's called the North American Development Bank, it's just U.S. and Mexico. Is there any way that we could think about expanding this to include Canada, that it would focus on borders in the North American space? I think that's probably going too far at this point in time. But certainly in the bilateral relationship, there is this idea that the North American Development Bank has been focused on sort of environmental issues at the U.S.-Mexico border. But maybe it's time to go beyond that. We've already moved into renewable energy. There's talk of moving it into cross-border gas pipelines. What if we were to think about a North American Development Bank that would invest in infrastructure at the U.S.-Mexico border that would try to facilitate and ease some of those backlogs, those jams that we face there? Because as many of the actors that we interact with have told us over and over again, there are hundreds of millions of dollars lost on an annual basis just by the delays that take place at the border. And it's crazy. There's no reason in today's world, with all the technologies that we have, that actually happens. And the solution, it's not rocket science. It's easy to do as long as we can get the political will there.
Yeah, as you know, Rich, interest in infrastructure ends at the water's edge or the boundary's edge. So everyone in your state or your province or your country would like to have a national or provincial bridge named after somebody famous. But as soon as you are crossing into another jurisdiction, there's really no incentive for you to invest political capital or money in carrying that infrastructure vision through. At the same time, what Duncan says about the NAD Bank is a good, I think it's a very good suggestion. So as you know, the NAD Bank, North American Development Bank, deals with primarily environmental and water things between the U.S. and Mexico. Canada's not even involved in that. But if you were to expand the mandate of the NAD Bank to operate much like an international joint commission, as a trilateral entity to review projects, to look at feasibility and prioritize needs and then make recommendations to national governments, at least you would have a filtering mechanism to identify where we should be putting our resources and investment.
Tony, if I can just come back. I mean, earlier on, Tony and I were talking about the 2014 Toluca North American Leaders Summit. And as part of that, I mean, there were efforts made. Sorry, there was a declaration there that the three countries would work together on joint trusted traveler programs, or at least to harmonize their trusted traveler programs. And, you know, global entry, the latest numbers I have are from March of last year, but it has, just over 5 million members. And then you don't count, all the people who are members of Sentry and Nexus. Mexico's Viajero Confiable program, which is the equivalent down there, has several hundred, maybe a few thousand members of it. This hasn't really taken off. There are things that we could do there on trusted traveler and trusted shipper programs that could ease some of the burden at the border. And just as importantly, in that 2014 summit, there was a declaration that the three countries would work together on issues of transportation. And there's so much that could be done on transportation just in identifying where the problems are on highways getting to the border. I'll never forget, a couple of years ago, I saw a fascinating presentation by somebody from the Banco de Mexico who had done a study of the average speed on every Mexican highway and working out exactly where the congestion was taking place. And if you had access to that data, then if you were a shipper, if you were driving a truck, and you say, well, it's going to take me much longer to go up to that traditional port crossing or border crossing, maybe I can go to another one. Having access to that kind of data and sharing that data with our North American counterparts would go a long way to actually building up a more complete picture of where the problems are.
Right. As Laura and Duncan have pointed out, there used to be a series of dialogues to address competitiveness broadly, addressing all of these things across North America. They have been suspended for the past 2.5 years, and at least I hope that if we get the USMCA passed, we can then pick this agenda up again and work on these things. Because the idea is in this new treaty, the new North American Trade Treaty. There's a whole chapter on this which you could pick up. Other questions, please.
Thank you. Thank you.
Microphone.
Fascinating. Thank you very much. I was saying thank you to our panelists and to Tony. It's just been brilliant. There's so many questions this all triggers, but one of them I have is when we think of immigration, be it from the South to the U.S., from the U.S. to Canada, wherever, talk about vetting people at the border. That seems to be a very inefficient place to vet people. How feasible would it be to ask people to apply for asylum or immigration, what have you, before they leave home, and ask our consuls general to check them out at home? You say you finished high school. Did they finish high school? You say no criminal record. Is there a criminal record? It would seem to be vastly facilitate things at the border and lead to much more favorable results on both sides, regardless what the two countries are, and regardless, et cetera. That's my question, at least one of them.
I can take that. Well, I do think it is feasible to send asylum officers currently down to the border to help expedite the process, just given the sheer amount of people that are there. But there is a program that was instated under the Obama administration called the Central American Minors Parole Program, which is essentially an in-country refugee processing program for certain Central American minors that qualified, that had family members in the United States and had been vetted in some ways before they were allowed to come to the United States. So programs like that can work in some ways to vet people before they make the dangerous journey to Mexico, to the United States. Now, I don't think that should be the solution to vet everyone, but it can be part of a comprehensive solution towards migration management.
And just to add on to that, I don't think that we're going to see that if you were to open up all U.S. consulates and embassies and say you can apply for asylum right here, it's not going to stop the flows from Central America, for the simple reason that people are desperate, you know, and people are willing to embark upon these incredibly dangerous journeys that are also very expensive. Just on the off chance that perhaps they can cross the border into the United States and claim refugee status. But if you can't claim refugee status, and we're seeing this right now with the Remain in Mexico program as it's being applied in northern Mexico, so refugee claimants are being forced to wait in Mexico until they can apply. What we're seeing is that many of them, in fact a majority of them, are just crossing the border illegally anyway. They're not going through the ports of entry. They're crossing between. And so what you do is, and it's always the case with migration, you come up with a partial solution here, and then everybody goes around it. I mean, and you can see it, I mean, graphically, as you see movements of people. You put in a border checkpoint here, people go around it. You put in a checkpoint on a highway, people learn very, very quickly. I mean, you know, the migrant telegram works incredibly fast so that you move around. So there has to be, it can be part of the solution, certainly, as Rachel said, but we need to think about a more comprehensive solution to it.
Thank you all very much. Thank you to our panel.
Thank you.